Good morning and welcome to our webinar, Politics in the Burbs, Why Suburban Voters Matter. My name is Maggie Stamets and I'm a sophomore majoring in journalism here at Hofstra University, and I'm originally from a small rural town in Colorado. I never thought I would be living on Long Island, the home of the iconic original suburb, Levittown. But here I am, and to my surprise, it's not all white picket fences and leave it to Beaver. Here to talk to us today is Larry Levy, Executive Dean of Hofstra University's National Center for Suburban Studies. Prior to joining Hofstra, he was Senior Editorial Writer and Chief Political Columnist for Newsday. During his 35 years as a reporter, editorial writer, columnist, and PBS Public Affairs show host, Larry won many of journalism's top awards, including Pulitzer Prize finalist for in-depth works on suburban politics, education, taxation, housing, and other key issues. Thank you for being here today, Larry.
Well, thank you for having me. This is fun.
So what kind of research is being done at the National Center for Suburban Studies, and why did you decide to start that program?
Well, those are two very different questions. Let me go answer the second one first. I was recruited by Hofstra, President Stuart Rabinowitz, who wanted to, as part of Hofstra's trajectory to being a significant national university, to form a program that looked at the suburbs not just locally, which Hofstra had done, but to put it in a national and even an international perspective. When I worked for Newsday during the presidential campaigns, I used to travel around the country and visit suburban areas either ahead of the presidential candidates or before they arrived there, and I would write columns to tell Long Islanders who didn't get to see presidential candidates, and we'll talk a little bit about why they don't get to see presidential candidates here. There was a lot of interest in that, and it gave me a reputation as being a guy who understood the suburbs, not just in my own backyard at the time when I lived in Huntington, and now I'm in Rockville Center for all you people out there. But I had an understanding of how it played out in some of the other suburbs that are very much like Long Island, but also very different. So we have a very broad agenda, as my academic partners say, a broad research agenda, everything from the arts to education to transportation, healthcare, any number of areas, all linking together the interests of the suburbs. So you may ask, well, why study the suburbs? Like, who cares about the suburbs? Well, back when my parents moved out here in 1955, they packed up there on the wagon train and went over the 59th Street Bridge and joined the throng that was heading out to Long Island. This was a very different place. They were literally, just like I'm sure many of you were, pioneers. You were going from cities that you and your parents and maybe your grandparents knew very well to wide open places where houses were going up like the potatoes that they replaced in the fields. Now, the suburbs were a very small part of the population back in the 40s and the 50s. And even in the 20s and 30s, they didn't even exist. The Census Bureau didn't even recognize them. But now, I can say that these are not your my mother and father's suburbs. They're not your suburbs. They are changing so quickly that they're not even my children's suburbs anymore. What's happened? Well, first of all, 50% or more of the people in the country live in suburban communities. So that makes it worth studying because there's a heck of a lot of you and of us. Also, it is the location of what we call very dynamic demographic change. It's aging very quickly. It also is gaining an enormous number of new immigrants. Some of the bad news is that the number of people in poverty are rising to the point where, and I'm going to tell you this and you're not going to believe it, but there are more poor people living in the American suburbs than in its central cities. And this is a jarring phenomenon for people who have been living in the suburbs. It puts a great strain, it's a great challenge for the political people, the agencies, both from the federal, state, and right down to the local levels. One of the big changes, though, that's germane to this discussion is that politically the suburbs are changing. Now, If you were all sitting in front of me, I would ask you to try to guess why and from your own experiences, your own community. But the suburbs in the late 40s, early 50s, 60s, even into the 70s were major bastions of Republican support. People moved away from the cities, which at the time were mostly controlled by, particularly if it was New York and Chicago, Detroit, by the Democratic ward bosses. You probably, if you ever lived in the cities back in the day, you knew that it was, if you wanted anything done in your neighborhood, you went to the political leader in the neighborhood. And that was even true when I was growing up. In the 60s, if you wanted a job and maybe you all remember this, if you wanted a job or you wanted to get a job for your kid at a state park, for example, to be a lifeguard or a ticket taker or a concession booth worker, you went to see the Republican leader because Nelson Rockefeller was the Republican governor. If you wanted to get a job in a county facility, and it were anywhere from 1961 to 68, you went to the Democratic leader because for that brief period, there was a Democrat for the Nassau County executive. And so it went. You didn't apply. It wasn't based necessarily on merit. It was based on who you knew. And generally, the most powerful person you could know was the political leader in your community. And back in that day, with the exception of that brief period where you had a Democratic county executive, the suburbs out here and around the country were controlled by Republicans. The other thing that happened was that the suburbs eventually became the most important voting bloc in the country. Now, if we all sat around on election day, any one of you out there, and we sat around and we said, okay, let's guess which candidate is going to win in the cities and by what margin. Well, we would all guess that the Democrats are going to win the cities because the cities have become centers of Democratic strength. There are a lot of traditional Democratic voters, Black, Latino, Jewish in the cities. And all the new immigrants are coming in, and most of them are voting Democratic as well. The Republican Party has gotten a bad name with some of its anti-immigrant policies. It's something that the Republican Party has to deal with if it's going to remain strong nationally. And I said to you, well, okay, who's going to win the rural areas? Who's going to win out in Wyoming and Kansas and Oklahoma? Well, we wouldn't have to be rocket scientists, much less political scientists, to guess that it's going to be the Republicans. And they would win by equal margins as the Democrats would in the cities. So who decides the election? It's the people in the middle. And if you had the leaders of the Democratic and Republican National Committees sitting right here with us, they would tell you that they could not predict the way the suburbs are going to go because they have become what we call the swing voting area. So when it comes to politics, the suburbs really matter. And we can talk more about that, but I want to go to Maggie's questions. I don't mean to go on and on and on.
What are the demographics of the typical suburban voters in the past, today, and do you expect to see great change in the future?
Well, it's changing so fast there almost isn't a typical. But if you want to take a snapshot, the typical suburban voter still is a white person, middle-aged, baby boomer, somebody who doesn't hate government, even though they might like to see it smaller, because they've come to realize that they're in the sandwich generation. If you've never heard the term, just visualize a sandwich, and you are the meat or the peanut butter and jelly in the middle. The top half, you're worrying about, your own. Depending upon your age, you may be worrying about parents. I have a mother who's 97 years old, and I'm going to be worrying. And I worry about her at the top end of the slice of bread. And I know that if I want to help provide care for her, I'm going to need a partner. And the partner with the deepest pockets is government. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid when it comes to some forms of nursing care. I also have children or grandchildren that I'm worrying about. I worry about their education. I worry about their ability to pay for college. I worry about whether there are going to be jobs for them. And again, while we can't rely on government for everything, and the typical voter does not want to rely on government for everything, they realize that the federal and state governments have to be their partner in providing for their children. So this is a voter that doesn't hate government, but it's also a voter that pays the highest taxes in the nation. Suburban voters pay the highest taxes in the nation. And they do so mostly willingly because they feel that they're getting value for their dollars, because they have the best schools, by and large, with pockets of poverty that we can talk about that are becoming a bigger and bigger problem. They have generally the best road networks because they're newer. They have the best public services because they generally have more money to spend than cities do. So the typical voter is not a dyed-in-the-wool ideological conservative. They're also not dyed-in-the-wool ideological liberal. They're people in the middle. And there are 40 congressional districts around the country that have flip-flopped back and forth over the last 8 to 10 years. And those are the places that will determine who controls Congress next year. Those are the places that will determine who is the President of the United States in 2016, as they have in every presidential campaign since, there's always debate about this, but I would say since 1988, since George Bush the Elder had his last presidential campaign, had his first presidential campaign.
All right, so as you've said many times, suburban voters are important. What are the issues that are drawing these voters to the polls?
Well, it's prosperity. Prosperity, prosperity, prosperity. Suburban voters are used to doing well. Unemployment in suburban areas tends to be lower than in urban or rural areas. People, once upon a time, could only move out to the suburbs if either they had the money themselves or they were being helped by the wonderful GI Bill program that may have helped some of you or your parents move out to Long Island. It subsidized housing for millions and millions of returning veterans and their families. So they're used to a high quality of life. They're used to good schools that they pay for through the nose, as you remember from paying your taxes. And they're used to safe streets. They're used to clean air. And while they put up with awful traffic when they're commuting, say, to and from the city or from their job on Long Island, they generally don't like and are accustomed to a lack of congestion in their own neighborhoods. It's the suburban dream. It's owning your little piece of land where you have neighbors, but you also have a fence that separates you from your neighbors, both literally and figuratively. When suburbanites feel threatened, their prosperity, or they feel that for some reason or another, they're not getting value for their dollars, or they feel they're being kind of taken for a ride, that the people in charge are selling them out either because of scandal, then they will rebel. Just like they rebelled against the Republican Party in 1992 when Bill Clinton finally figured out, the first Democrat finally figured out that the election was going to be decided in the suburbs and that he had to offer a middle-of-the-road centrist approach, not just in policy but in tone, to woo the suburban voters. And he was successful in 92, and he was successful again in 96. And then, we went back and forth, and we're still going back and forth.
So do you believe that people in the suburbs are voting based on their beliefs of social issues or with their pocketbooks?
Well, that's a great question. Primarily, and all of these have been great questions, primarily, it's pocketbook issues that drive suburban voters. It's really pocketbook issues that drive all voters. They just interpret pocketbook in different ways. I mean, if you are a city, a middle-class person in New York City, and somebody raises the subway fare on you by 50 cents, or closes a neighborhood school that requires you to take another half hour to get your kid to the next neighborhood, we may see this as an educational or social issue, but it's really a pocketbook issue. It's just the way they interpret it through the lens of how they live and how they perceive their lives. But mostly it's pocketbook issues. But when suburbanites feel that one party or another has gone a little off or at least toward the deep end, and the Democrats suffered for this during the 60s and 70s, and if not for the scandal of Richard Nixon and Watergate, and a feeling that Gerald Ford wasn't up to being president and had let Richard Nixon off the hook by pardoning him, we would have had an unbroken stretch of Republican presidents for many years, because the typical moderate, and that's the key word, moderate suburban voter just felt the Democratic Party was interested in things that they didn't care about. They saw the Democrats as the party of the cities, the party of big government special interests. There were racial tensions in the country for many years. We may still feel those tensions, but we're talking about cities burning. If you may remember the bad old times in the 60s. And people fled, white people particularly fled the cities because they wanted to get away to their safer suburbs. And many politicians in the suburbs, out here it was Republicans, but in other places it was also Democrats, played the race card to get elected in the suburbs. They would accuse their opponents of trying to citify. And out here it used to be the sixth borough, making Nassau the sixth borough of New York City. And what they were doing was saying, basically, in my humble opinion, as a chief political columnist for Newsday who watched this up close for 20 years, they were playing the race card. They were saying to the voters, if you elect the other guy, he's going to let black and Latino people come out to Long Island. You elect me, I will do what I can to keep that from happening. And it was a card that played very well in the suburbs for many years until some things began to change. And that was demographics. It was new people moving out, new people, just like when my parents moved out. Let me tell you a story. I talk to groups that are often, upset about the new immigrants, particularly the Latinos. They don't speak the same language as they do. They have different customs. They live in different ways. I find it very interesting ways, but other people find it uncomfortable. Well, I remember when my parents moved out to Valley Stream in 1955, and Valley Stream was a prosperous middle-class community dominated by German, Dutch Protestants, very proud community. And all of a sudden, over a 5-year period, there was a rush of Jewish and Italian and Irish Catholics moving out. Blessed Sacrament, grew up, a brand new parish, Holy Name, expanded with a new school. And they're wondering, my God, what's going to happen to our community with all these people? Some of them don't even speak English. They speak Italian. And we can't even understand those Irish people. I don't know what kind of English they're speaking. And the Jewish people, oh my God, what are they going to do to us? Well, that story ended pretty well for Long Island, pretty good, as we say on the street, for Long Island. It became a golden age where these Irish, Italians, and Jews primarily, and also there was a black and Latino migration as well that hasn't been chronicled in the same way, and we are trying to do that now with our Diverse Suburbs Oral History Project. But it turned out well when everybody started working together and accepting each other. And we really need, not to editorialize or give a sermon, but we really need to take another look at all these newcomers and remember what it was like when we or our parents or grandparents came out, because if we don't start working together, if we don't find a way to embrace our diversity, we are in real trouble, because this diversity is the key to our social and economic survival. My sermon is over. Let's go back to Maggie's great questions.
Okay, going in a slightly different direction. Are young people participating in voting? And if not, how can we work to bring more young people to the polls?
Yeah. With the exception of Barack Obama's 2 presidential campaigns, young people have not been pulling their weight. They have not been voting in proportion to their share of the population. Barack Obama stirred something in these young voters and got them to the polls in droves. And they were pulling their weight. In some cases, they were voting even beyond their proportion of the population. And this is a bad sign for the Republican Party and why they need to kind of take a fresher approach to their politics. And we'll get into the ramifications of the shutdown for the two political parties if we have time and we get the questions on them. What political scientists have found is that, like newspaper reading, voting is a habit. And the party that people vote for relatively early in life is the party that they tend to stick with. They will depart, just like a lot of Democratic voters went for Ronald Reagan, and a lot of Democratic voters went for Richard Nixon because they were turned off by their traditional party. But a lot of the so-called Reagan Democrats, you may have heard that term before, have come back to the Democratic Party, by and large. They came back and voted for Bill Clinton in '92 and in '96, and mostly came back to vote for Barack Obama. So young voters hold the key to the election, and it was young suburban voters who really rallied in their communities and made the suburbs a place where Barack Obama was able to do better than you'd ever imagine that an African-American candidate could do in neighborhoods that are still predominantly white. With all the growth in minority neighborhoods in the suburbs, a place like Long Island, for example, is still about 60% white. By 2035, there will be no majority population on Long Island. And by 2050, it will be probably majority Latino and Asian, if you combine the two together.
Okay, and you touched on this briefly, but how will the recent issues on the national level, the shutdown, affect local voters?
I think that's the best question of all, and it's one that the media is not paying a lot of attention to. I was quoted in a New York Times piece, not to name drop, I'm sorry, where they finally got around to talking about local races, the Nassau County Executive race, for example, or the Westchester County Executive if you're up in White Plains. Did White Plains come in? Did we have White Plains here? Okay. There's a great race up there where the incumbent Astorino is in what the polls seem to indicate is a relatively tight race. In 2009, what was going on? Obamacare, sometimes these issues never go away, but Obamacare was a major, major issue that divided parties between and among themselves. And the progressive, the liberal left wing of the Democratic Party was angry at Barack Obama because they thought he didn't get enough for Obamacare. The conservative right wing of the Republican Party was angry, and it was even beyond the right wing. Most Republicans were angry that Obama got as much as he got, which may tell you that he got about what was tolerable for the political middle. And so what happened in 2009 in the Nassau County executive election with an incumbent, Tom Suozzi, who had nothing to do with Obamacare, is that liberal Democrats sat on their hands. They didn't work for Suozzi, and conservative Republicans, driven by new Tea Party fervor, worked very hard. Now, why take it out on a local Democrat? Well, they were angry at the party. The brand of the Democratic Party to these people had been tarnished. Liberal Democrats felt their party didn't care about the things that they cared about, and Republicans felt the Democratic Party had gone too far. So what happened is only 25% of Democrats turned out in 2009, and 36% of Republicans turned out, which is a fairly healthy number. I think it's horrible, but traditionally, it's a healthy number in local elections to have 36% turnout. And as a result, Tom Suozzi lost by 400 votes out of 200,000. So obviously, if the same number of Democrats had come out as Republicans, the Democratic incumbent would have won. So it's arguable, and I argued it fervently when I was writing columns that year, that it was Obamacare that went a long way towards sinking a local Democrat. And it became what we call a canary in the coal mine, a bellwether for what happened in 2010. And if you remember, 2010, Democrats got wiped out in Congress, and the Republicans got the majority in the House, and it was so 2009, if one was paying attention to the local races, you got a glimpse of what was to come nationally in 2010. So a good question, and I think you were going to follow up with this, is the government shutdown has greatly tarnished the Republican brand nationally. So what I'm going to be looking for, and I know, and I'm not a political scientist, I'm a political journalist, but political scientists, political journalists, political activists, people who run campaigns are going to be watching races like the Westchester County executive race and the Nassau County executive race to see what kind of damage there was to the respective parties. The Democrats haven't gotten a free ride on this one. The rollout of Obamacare has hurt Democrats. Whether that's powerful enough to cause what we call a wave election, where a wave builds up, washes out even popular local people who otherwise would have won by a lot, remains to be seen. But I know the Republicans here locally in Westchester and in Nassau are worried about the impact of the actions of ultra-conservatives. You know, by the typical voter, the moderate suburban voter, he would, right now, wouldn't get 35% or 40% of the vote. So again, it's he thinks this is great, that he's fighting the good fight, and that it is making him a leader of a major faction of his party. But in terms of what it does to the reputation of that party is potentially create problems for candidates in moderate states and in moderate communities.
Okay, and one more question from White Plains. White Plains, are you ready? Okay, we can hear you. Go ahead.
The recent fiasco by the Republican Party. Why does the Republican hierarchy allow the Tea Party to control them to this extent? It's throwing them for the future elections.
Well, there's an implication in your question that the Republican hierarchy can control the Tea Party. Remember, this is a democracy, and the Tea Party started at least in the grassroots. It may have been taken over by big interests. The Koch brothers have been funding it, and a lot of other people who have supported right-wing causes, conservative causes. But the Republican Party elects its candidates in primaries where people have a right to campaign. When a member of Congress is elected from a very conservative district, he or she comes to Congress and is representing those views. They're not interested in what Long Island thinks. They're interested in what Wichita, Kansas thinks, or a district in Oklahoma thinks. And they think very different than the moderate swing conservative voters. So, I can't answer the question because the underlying assumption I don't think is quite correct, with all due respect, and that what you have is, as messy as it is, you have democracy playing out on the Republican side. Both sides, all sides, and it's not just two sides, there's 3 or 4 or 5 different sides here, have plenty of money, they have plenty of supporters, and they're going to have to fight it out. And whether it comes down one day to 5 leaders getting together and figuring out whether they can compromise, or they're going to fight it out through a primary and have to go through a huge loss, such as they did in '64, when everybody thought the Democratic Party was going to rule the roost for generations. And then things happen. Vietnam came along, racial tensions flared, and the Democrats became tarnished among these swing voters. So the Republicans are going to have to play this out, and there is nobody who can say, yeah, you guys have to do this.
Okay. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this morning, but thank you so much to our Bristol residents for joining us and asking our questions. Thank you again, Larry, for being with
Thank you
us.
for having me. Thank you for your patience with me. And one day, hopefully, we'll talk again.
And we hope to see you at the next webinar. Have a great day.